As I mentioned before we start the show today, we have a guest joining us. He is, I'm in California, and he's joining us by phone. I want to tell you a bit about him before he comes on. Our guest today is Kevin Freeman. He's been on the show at least a couple of times. I think when it was back when it was still on Salem Radio, but it's great to have him here joining us on America Can We Talk. And he is, by background, he is an author. He wrote Secret Weapon and Game Plan. He's also the host of, the founder of a fabulous show program called Economic War Room. Economic War Room covers all sorts of issues related to the basic idea of protecting America from economic terrorism. He, Kevin Freeman, is a leading expert on the issues of economic warfare and financial terrorism. He is highly regarded in Washington, D.C. He's consulted for and briefed members of the U.S. House and the Senate, present and past CIA, DIA, FBI, SEC, Homeland Security, Justice Department, and other local, state, and law enforcement officials, because he truly is an expert on the idea of this economic warfare. And the reason I wanted to have him join us today is because he had something on the show recently that I want to ask him to explain to all of us, to share what the idea is, and have him really help all of us understand the many ways in which America can be attacked, even though it's not a military attack. So without further ado, I believe we have Kevin Freeman. Hello, sir.
Hello, Debbie.
Thanks so much for joining me. Well, you had a piece on your program. You were talking about what is happening in America, concern that you and others have expressed about the idea of United States money being potentially invested into China through retirement funds and other vehicles. So I want to have you just, if you would, give us the deep explanation. What is it the concern is? What is the concern? What's happening in America that causes a concern about American money being invested in China?
Well, Debbie, if you can just imagine back to the middle of the Cold War, the early 1980s, and the Soviet Union was threatening us. They were building the largest military on the planet. There were regular discussion of whether or not the freedom of the United States could survive. Maybe the Soviet model was superior. President Carter in the late 70s and just before President Reagan was elected was telling us that we may not have an American century, we may not be the superpower. Just imagine if in the middle of that, the average American was taking their savings and investing it in Russia, in the Soviet Union. How detrimental that would have been to exposing the failure of communism. And unfortunately, what we're seeing happen right now, as we're in the midst of an economic war with China, one that no one had recognized prior to President Trump, really, at least not in the administration, we're funding the Chinese. We're funding their persecution of the Uyghurs. We're funding their organ transplants. We're funding their surveillance of their people. We're funding their Belt and Road Initiative where they're stealing intellectual property. We're funding all of that, and we're just not aware of it.
Okay, that is obviously deeply troubling. And yes, you are so right. More Americans, because of President Trump's actions as president, more aware that China is an enemy of America, that China is really one of the major power to watch as it's very expansionist. But how specifically is America funding those bad things that China is doing?
Well, the Chinese have been very clever in that they have put themselves into our stock markets in such a way that there is something close to $2 trillion of money that Americans hold that's invested in these Chinese companies that we think, wow, what a great opportunity. I want to make money in China. And so people have bought them actively, whether it's a pension fund or individuals or the thrift savings plan of the United States. And it's just become, I have to invest in China. China is a great opportunity. And yet that is the source of their capital for a really failing economic system. We've been propping it up because we keep wanting to invest in good opportunities.
So, Kevin, I love that you're explaining all this. I want to go to kind of 2 points about it. One is that some of this seems to have been occurring with respect to the military's savings plan, the thrift savings plan, I think it's called, within the military while you're serving. You can put money into thrift savings, and thrift savings plans themselves, that is not money being directed by the individual member of the military. It's money put into a program which is then invested to help these service members have some assets when they get out. So the thrift savings plans are involved in investing in China. Is that right?
Well, yeah, then it's insidious. It's very clever. It's sneaky how they did it. The thrift savings plans decided that they were going to switch the index that they were invested in from the EFA index, which is developed nations. It's essentially Europe, Australasia, and the Far East that did not include China, to what is known as the MSCI All-Country World Index, which is Morgan Stanley and Capital International formed an index to measure the values of stocks around the world. And the All-Country World Index, the Chinese lobbied to get the weighting of Chinese securities in that index quadrupled over the last year. And then there was this effort to put the thrift savings plan out of the Europe, Australasia, Far East investments into the all-country index. And so all of a sudden, if you're a service member and you have an international aspect to your portfolio, you want to own any foreign stocks, you're being forced to own Chinese stocks among them, which is just unacceptable to me, because our servicemen and women are literally funding our adversary, and they're using that money that's developed to develop weapons that might be used against us. It's just unconscionable.
I love your analogy at the beginning that it would be as though during World War II, American investment dollars were going in to strengthen Germany or strengthen Japan. We would see it clearly. We'd say, my gosh, that's terrible. We got to pull that back. But I want to ask you, who is it? So the thrift savings plan wanted to switch the index they were going to go to, but the thrift saving plan just has a board and the board decided, or was that a governmental decision? Like, who makes a decision like that?
Well, there is a board, and they decide, but they have a consultant, and the consultant says that it would be wise to include emerging markets, and we don't want to be picking the emerging markets, so there was a recommendation from the consultant. Now, I cannot rule out Chinese influence. We know that the Chinese have bought up parts of Hollywood to influence Hollywood. We know that they put Confucius Institutes on college campuses to influence higher education. So it is entirely possible that the Chinese have spent money, lobbied, bribed, whatever, in order to get this decision to take place, because literally it's going to move billions of dollars into Chinese coffers. So the money is certainly there, and it is certainly in line with what they would do, but it's either an innocuous failure to really understand what's going on by the consultants, or it is a purposed, planned intrusion by the Chinese government. Either way, the net result is the same. Patriotic employees of the government, patriotic retirees of the government, patriotic servicemen and women, and patriotic veterans will be investing in Chinese securities where there is no transparency. We don't have the ability to go and audit them like the U.S. companies are subject to audit. They've been excluded from that. They may not have any shareholder rights. They may not have any of the protections that we build in for American companies that are required when you make an investment. The Chinese are literally getting the money, and we may be getting nothing of value in return.
It is truly shocking. And I also, on this particular point, with respect to China, I think for a long time, Americans thought that if we invested in China, we would help move China forward into the modern era, that China would become a more open market, that actually investing really was going to help the people of China, because they would be, they have more wherewithal, there'd be more abundance in their economy and their stock market. So we're really just kind of helping China move forward into the modern era, maybe pushing back against a communist control over the economy, maybe helping move toward free markets. But that has not been the trend in China. It has not been the reaction of American involvement with Chinese companies. It's been exactly the opposite. And I know you talked about this a lot in your show. If you could just briefly say or comment on the idea that the investment in China is really detrimental to the people of China, because the Chinese government is actually is still a repressive communist government that doesn't really benefit the people of China like Americans thought it would. Is that right?
Oh, that's absolutely correct, Debbie. For example, one of the investments on the index is Hike Vision surveillance cameras. And Hike Vision surveillance cameras is monitoring the Chinese people using the social credit scores, controlling the people wherever they can, put in the concentration camps that are persecuting the Muslim population there, known as the Uyghurs. It really is bad for the Chinese people. We've taken them not into modern society, we've taken them to postmodern society and really dystopian society, because now they are literally, imagine Adolf Hitler with the ability to monitor every citizen, every camera on every street, more cameras than there are people, and controlling. If you say the wrong thing, your bank account gets cut off, or you're not allowed to get on an airplane or a train or buy food. I mean, it literally is that level of control. And again, it's American technology and the technological breakthroughs that we've had combined with American money that is funding this, and we've been hurting the Chinese people. Worst case of it is the forced organ transplanting that's taken place, and a lot of the money for that has come again from Americans.
And Americans who would absolutely not want to have the money go toward any of those items you just mentioned. I want to ask you about, I saw that Marco Rubio, Republican senator from Florida, and Jeanne Shaheen, Democrat from New Hampshire, came together, put together a bill in the Senate, essentially trying to force or to bring about the result that their savings plans could not be invested in securities on the mainland China exchange. I mean, they're trying to legislate a solution to this, and I actually don't even know the answer. I don't know if you do, but where does that legislation sit? Do you know?
It's not been voted on, as far as I know. It's not passed into law. Certainly, it is something I think the president would sign, and it's very, very needed legislation. You mentioned it's bipartisan. It makes all the sense in the world. But the Chinese lobby is a very powerful lobby inside Washington, and this is literally cutting off billions of dollars. So they will oppose this with everything that they possibly can. So it is something we need to do. The other thing we need to do is we need to require that if you list your stock on an American stock exchange like Chinese companies have done, that you have to be subject to the same transparency rules, you have to be subject to the same audits and everything else as an American company, so that you're on equal footing. Otherwise, you don't get listed. And these are simple things that we can and should do that would protect the American investor.
It's actually shocking that we don't do that we have all these laws. Americans are very aware of all the regulation involved when you want to list your company or stock on the New York Stock Exchange or any of the stock exchanges, all the requirements of transparency and audits and you were supervised in essence by the SEC, the federal government, and yet we have Chinese companies already known to be we don't know much about them, we can't control them, we don't know whether they have fairness to shareholders, we don't know anything they do, and we don't impose our own laws on those companies, and yet they can list themselves on our stock exchange. That's truly shocking. Truly shocking. Great idea you had to require them to do that. One other thing I know I want to honor our time commitment today. I want to be sure and give you a chance to talk about. You came up with something I just love, and it was the idea that you, being who you are, you're extremely knowledgeable. You're one of the world's experts on just cyber, on economic warfare, financial terrorism. You came up with an idea of helping American stock advisors or financial advisors look at the portfolio of investments they hold and help them recognize whether or not the investments they're doing they are committing their clients' money to are also investments that involve helping China. I probably didn't describe that nearly as well as you can. So would you please explain I think it's called your NSIC Institute. Can you explain that?
Right. Well, there's a problem somewhere between 15 and 30 trillion dollars around the world that's invested in so-called socially responsible investments, mostly related to green energy, climate change issues, and so forth. Our idea is that we're training financial advisors who have clients that want to be patriotic with their investments. They don't want to be funding China. They want to be funding American investments. And so rather than telling them what to invest in, we offer to train their advisors so the advisors can work with them and find the right investments for that particular individual, because there's no one size fits all in investing, and you might not want to invest in certain things depending on your age and how much money you have and so forth. So we train the advisors how to look at client portfolios and find if there's anything that's anti-patriotic, and then also to find investment ideas that are patriotic, so that it preserves American culture, American national security, and so forth. The traditional values that we all hold dear, which would be free enterprise, free markets, belief in God in a Judeo-Christian format, and strong national security. And I want my investments to be directed in that area, because I don't want my money working against what I believe in my heart. And that's basically the idea. NSIC.org is the website, or you can learn more at economicwarroom.com.
Well, you just answered the last question I was going to say is I would love to have our listeners, I want to encourage our listeners to watch all of your programs, fabulous programs. And so it is economicwarroom.com. If they want to find you, they can go to Economic War Room and find all of the videos you've done, all the interviews you've done that share so much, just a wealth of information Americans really do want to know. And also to encourage our listeners. In fact, I think we were on my show before, we were talking about your first book, Secret Weapon. And then you have another book, Game Plan. And in any case, I want to encourage our listeners to really follow you as a thought leader in the arena of economic warfare, financial terrorism. It's kind of a whole warfare that's not military, and it's not visible to most people, but very impactful to America. And I love that you bring those issues to light in America. So Kevin Freeman, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Debbie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Love to have you. Thank you so much. I tell you, folks, this guy, Kevin Freeman, he is one really smart guy, number one. He raises issues that if you go to economicwarroom.com and play some of their videos, you realize there are a lot of things you didn't know, but you really should have known. And he explains them in ways that everyone can follow. He has great guests explaining the issues that he follows. And honestly, he is, at least as far as I'm aware, the only American I know working very hard to make sure Americans are aware of economic war as another form of war engaged in by our enemies against us, which we sometimes don't even know about.